Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be part 2 in my series on the Lake of Fire. If you haven't watched part 1 in this series yet, I recommend watching that first because we cover a lot of information that's going to be redundant to repeat in this video, so I will link that for you below. Since we're going to be discussing the topic of the Lake of Fire in this video, we are going to be going over some passages in the Bible that deal with the subject of divine judgment. I just want to make a quick note before I start. It's important to take these passages within proper cultural context. Although I do believe that the Bible is inspired, the Bible itself says that God's power is perfected in our weakness. This means that God doesn't wait for us to have a perfect understanding of Him in order to work through us or to speak through us. And thousands of years ago, particularly when the Old Testament was written, people had a very tribal, warlike, primitive view of God. So when we read passages where God in His anger is threatening to pour out fire and brimstone on people for their sin, we have to remember that this is just how people viewed their gods thousands of years ago. And we can only properly learn what we need to from these passages when we understand that this is somebody's story, somebody's subjective experience filtered through the lenses of their time and culture. Then we can take the underlying truth of the passages, which is that God's judgments are not so much God sitting up in heaven pouring out wrath on the earth in His anger, as much as they are the natural result of us collectively living in disharmony with our environment. Having said that, let's move on to the topic of today's video. Just briefly, in the previous video, we discovered that the phrase lake of fire was a Hebrew idiom that referenced the Dead Sea area where the fiery judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah had occurred. Let's quickly remind ourselves of the language that is used in the Sodom and Gomorrah passage. Then the Lord rained down fire and burning sulfur from the sky on Sodom and Gomorrah. He utterly destroyed them, along with the other cities and villages of the plain, wiping out all the people and every bit of vegetation. Abraham got up early that morning and hurried out to the place where he had stood in the Lord's presence. He looked out across the plain toward Sodom and Gomorrah and watched as columns of smoke rose from the cities like smoke from a furnace. Throughout the Bible, we find many warnings of Sodom-like judgment. Here's just a few examples. He will rain down blazing coals and burning sulfur on the wicked, punishing them with scorching winds. Psalms 11:6. I will punish you and your armies with disease and bloodshed. I will send torrential rain, hailstones, fire, and burning sulfur. Ezekiel 38:22. I will pour out my terrible fury on this place. Its people, animals, trees, and crops will be consumed by the unquenchable fire of my anger. Jeremiah 7:20. The day of judgment is coming, burning like a furnace. On that day, the arrogant and the wicked will be burned up like straw. They will be consumed, roots, branches, and all. Malachi 4:1. Without exception, all of these passages and many other to be found in the Old Testament are speaking of earthly, physical destruction that will come upon societies that reject God or live out of alignment with God. And we know that it is earthly destruction because, first of all, many of these prophecies were fulfilled with earthly destruction. But also because at this time in history, the Jews did not really put a lot of thought into the afterlife. In fact, they likely didn't even believe in the resurrection during the time in history when most of these passages were written. When you were dead, you went to Sheol and basically slept for the rest of eternity. The thought process went that God would punish the wicked and reward the righteous during this lifetime. But to get back to our topic, what's interesting is that all of the passages that we just quoted, speaking of earthly judgment, use the language of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction. Furnace of fire, unquenchable fire, raining fire and brimstone from the sky. Why is this? In his book, Her Gates Will Never Be Shut, Brad Jersak quotes Simmons in his book, The Bottomless Pit. The overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah made a permanent impression upon the human psyche. All subsequent literature, pagan and divine, portraying hell as a place of sulfurous fumes and continuous burnings derives from this source. Fire and brimstone thus became synonymous with the fate of the wicked. So, as we saw in the previous video, the Dead Sea area where the judgment of Sodom had occurred was perpetually burning for hundreds of years after the destruction and sporadically emitting fire and smoke for up to millennia afterwards, Sodom-like destruction came to be seen as a metaphorical reference to divine judgment. So language like unquenchable fire and smoke rising day and night, and sulfur raining from the sky, and even lake of fire was not meant literally, but embodied the thought of the ancient world concerning and surrounding the subject of divine judgment. For instance, Jeremiah 7:20, which we quoted above, which prophesies that Jerusalem will be destroyed with unquenchable fire. What was the fulfillment of that passage? Was it literal unquenchable fire that is still burning to this day? No, the fulfillment of that passage was the Babylonian army which destroyed Jerusalem. Any fire that was used in this process went out long ago. The phrase unquenchable fire likely found its root in the seemingly unquenchable fire of the Dead Sea area, which was likely still burning at the time of Jeremiah's writing. It was a constant reminder of God's judgment that they could see with their own eyes if they visited the area. And this brings us to the lake of fire passages in the book of Revelation. In Isaiah chapter 34, we see the most direct link between earthly divine judgments and the Revelation's passages. And this is just a little bit gruesome, so fair warning. Come here and listen, O nations of the earth. Let the world and everything in it hear my words. For the Lord is enraged against the nations. His fury is against all their armies. He will completely destroy them, dooming them to slaughter. Their dead will be left unburied, and the stench of rotting bodies will fill the land. The mountains will flow with their blood. So right here we have very Gehenna-like language. Now, Gehenna was the word that Jesus used to predict the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And the word Gehenna finds its roots in Jeremiah predictions about the earlier destruction of Jerusalem when the Babylonians came and took them into captivity. I will link my videos on Gehenna below for those interested. The streams of Edom will be filled with burning pitch, and the ground will be covered with fire. This judgment on Edom will never end. The smoke of its burning will rise forever. And here it is, the reference to Sodom-like judgment. Smoke rising forever and ever. Burning pitch or tar, which we learned in the last video, there were tar pits in the Dead Sea area. So burning pitch or tar is a direct reference to the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now let's jump over to Revelations 14. Anyone who worships the beast and his statue, or who accepts his mark on the forehead or on the hand, must drink the wine of God's anger. It has been poured full strength into God's cup of wrath, and they will be tormented with fire and burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and the Lamb. The smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever, and they will have no relief day or night, for they have worshipped the beast and his statue, and have accepted the mark of his name. This is a direct quote from Isaiah 34, and most people take this passage today to be speaking of an afterlife event where God is going to take people and throw them into a burning lake of fire and sulfur to be tormented for eternity. This idea has developed over time as centuries and millennia have separated us from the cultural context in which Revelation was written. The Revelations passage quoting the Isaiah passage was most likely a reference to earthly divine judgment similar to what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, and it was a word picture being used to make a point referencing that fire that burned for millennium and the smoke that rose forever. Probably earthly destruction of those who worshipped the beast, in other words, the Roman Empire under which the early Christians lived, and at whose hands they were being severely persecuted. Clearly, people did not literally burn forever in the fire of Sodom and Gomorrah, nor did the fire itself actually burn forever, because the fire has long since gone out. The number one thing that we have to remember about Revelation is that it is a metaphorical book. People like to pick and choose what they take literally. A beast rising out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns? Clearly metaphorical. A wounded lamb? Obviously metaphorical. A lake of fire that torments people forever? Now that's gotta be literal. No, clearly it is a word picture tied to a historical event being used to make a point. Societies that live in opposition to God will bring destruction upon themselves, and this has indeed happened over and over throughout history. This is actually a very real and relevant warning to us today, because we, at this point in history, are on the brink of either suffering Gehenna, as Jesus talked about, or evolving forward into oneness. This is the exact choice that is before us at this point in history. And we see it manifesting in many of the world events that are currently taking place. I believe that the lake of fire is the exact same thing that Jesus talked about when he talked about Gehenna. And again, I'll link my videos on Gehenna below. There's a lot of background information on Gehenna that connects to the lake of fire. But basically, it's the natural consequences of living out of alignment with God, which brings disharmony into the environment. Violence breeds violence. Manipulation and control breeds discontent and uprising. Greed and waste brings destruction to the environment and of necessity cleansing. The fire and brimstone language in the Bible is used specifically of societies that live collectively out of alignment with God. And remember, God is one. So God is in your neighbor. God is in your enemy. God is in the creation, the sky, the trees. God transcends all of these things, but he is in all of them. He is closer than the air that we breathe. When we live in malice towards our enemy, we are living in malice towards God. When we pollute the environment, when we rage at someone in traffic next to us, when we oppress somebody who's different from us, we are polluting and raging against and oppressing God. And clearly, God can't be polluted or oppressed, but you get my point. This actually was the exact message of Jesus on the cross. We sacrifice somebody for our own sins, and then we realize, wait a minute, we just sacrificed God. When we live this way, we will experience God within us and surrounding us as fire, due to our own disharmony with him, not due to anything on God's end. In some cases, this has been literal fire, like with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah or the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. But in most cases, the fire is metaphorical for the suffering that results from our destructive and disharmonious way of life, which I do believe can be experienced both in this life and in the next. It's very important not to downplay the warning. I'm not saying that there is no lake of fire. What I'm saying is that I don't think the Bible, when taken in proper historical context, supports the idea of a lake of fire as a literal fire in the afterlife that God throws people into that will then torment them consciously for eternity. No, the more real and relevant warning is that the lake of fire is here now, to be experienced here and now by anybody who cannot recognize God in his or her neighbor. In fact, when you dive into the historical context surrounding the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, it becomes very clear that Sodom's number one sin was not what most people think it is. The sin of Sodom was being arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. You can look up and read stories that have been passed down about how wealthy they were, and yet they burned people at the stake for secretly helping the poor. And maybe these stories have become exaggerated with time, but the point remains that the reason for Sodom's destruction was because they were greedy and arrogant and unconcerned about the poor at their gates. The warning of the lake of fire has a lot more to do with how we treat people right now. But in the event that the lake of fire is an afterlife location, even in that case, I still don't see any reason from the text to believe that it will last forever. In fact, we are told that the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah that happened in the Dead Sea area, from which the phrase lake of fire was derived, will not be eternal. Ezekiel 16. But someday I will restore the fortunes of Sodom and Samaria, and I will restore you too. Yes, your sisters, Sodom and Samaria, and all their people will be restored. And at that time you also will be restored. So here the prophet is speaking to Israel and saying that their sin is actually worse than the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, and that judgment is going to come upon them just like it did upon Sodom. but that ultimately the purpose of that judgment is so that both of them may be restored. Yet I will remember the covenant I made with you when you were young, and I will establish an everlasting covenant with you. I will make your sisters Samaria and Sodom to be your daughters, even though they are not part of our covenants. So this is very Old Testament language, speaking of Sodom and Samaria not being part of the covenant, but the point was that what was considered to be the worst of the worst in that culture, Sodom, would one day eventually be restored. Skipping ahead to Ezekiel chapter 47, Ezekiel is being shown a vision, and the person speaking to him in the vision asks, "Have you been watching, Son of Man?" Then he led me back along the riverbank. When I returned, I was surprised by the sight of many trees growing on both sides of the river. Then he said to me, "This river flows east through the desert into the valley of the Dead Sea." Remember, the Dead Sea is where the destruction of Sodom happened. The Dead Sea is the lake of fire. The waters of this stream will make the salty waters of the Dead Sea fresh and pure. There will be swarms of living things wherever the water of this river flows. Fish will abound in the Dead Sea, for its waters will become fresh. Life will flourish wherever this water flows, but the marshes and swamps will not be purified. Remember that word. They will still be salty. Fruit trees of all kinds will grow along both sides of the river. The leaves of these trees will never turn brown and fall, and there will always be fruit on their branches. There will be a new crop every month, for they are watered by the river flowing from the temple. The fruits will be for food and the leaves for healing. So here we are told that the river of life, flowing from the throne of God, or the temple of God, will flow into the lake of fire and bring it to life. It will be purified to the point where there will be trees of life and healing growing on its banks, which the book of Revelation tells us will be healing for the nations being the people who were within the lake of fire. So the judgment that befell the lake of fire was for purification. And there is so much more that we could dig into here with the prophecies in Ezekiel and Isaiah about the lake of fire being brought to life, and I'm comparing those to the Revelations passages, but we will have to save that for another video. For now, I will leave you with this quote from Brian Zahn's beautiful presentation of the gospel in Chairs, which perfectly sums up everything that we've been talking about. "Love is greater than the grave, and though you make your bed in Sheol, I, God, am there. There is no place where God is not. He fills all things with his love, for God is love. And there flows from the heart of God's love a river of fire. To those that respond to God's love with love, they return love for love. That love of God, like a river of fire, provides light and warmth. But to those who respond with hatred towards God's love, they experience that river of fire as wrath." The Apostle Paul said it this way, "If your enemy is hungry, feed him. It will be like burning coals on his head." But all he has to do is turn around and say, instead of hating, "I will love." This is the meaning of the lake of fire. Purifying, redemptive love, not eternal, conscious torment. Be loved, be happy, be at peace, and thank you for watching.